Every fall, my search and rescue (SAR) team holds an annual campout. It's a chance for us to train, bond, and recharge in the outdoors. Over the years, these retreats became something I looked forward to, a mix of hard work, camaraderie, and the thrill of sharpening skills that might one day save a life. But one particular year stands out, not because of the training or the team, but because of what happened during a night session. To this day, it's the most unsettling experience I've ever had. We were running a nighttime training drill. My dog Brody, an Australian Shepherd mix trained for cadaver detection and man-trailing, was by my side. He was an incredible partner, sharp, focused, and always eager to work. The drill that night was a standard exercise, following a scent trail to simulate locating a missing person. The woods were dense, and the cool air carried the faint smell of decaying leaves. As we moved deeper into the darkness, Brody suddenly alerted. His posture changed, head low, tail wagging with purpose. He'd caught a scent, and whatever it was, he was locked in. The trail didn't match the direction of the exercise setup, but Brody was insistent, pulling hard on the lead. Trusting his instincts, I decided to follow. The terrain grew rough as we moved away from the designated training area. The ground was uneven, and the darkness pressed in, making it hard to navigate. Brody led me to a dried creek bed. The slick rocks beneath my boots made more treacherous by the dampness lingering from an earlier rain. I was moving cautiously, but one wrong step was all it took. I slipped. The fall happened so fast I barely had time to react. My feet shot out from under me, and I slid down the embankment, rocks tearing at my clothes and skin. Before I could stop myself, I went over the edge of a small cliff. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and a sharp pain flared in my side. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. When I tried to breathe, pain stabbed through my ribs. I knew immediately something was wrong. Broken ribs, maybe worse. My head throbbed, and everything felt hazy. Reaching for my GPS unit, I activated the emergency alert. It was a direct line to our base camp, signaling that I needed help. Then, as I lay there trying to focus on breathing, I realized something chilling. Brody was gone. The silence was suffocating. I could hear my own labored breaths, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional creak of a tree shifting. Minutes dragged by, each one stretching endlessly. And then I heard it, footsteps. At first, I thought it was my team, responding to the alert. But the steps were hesitant, uneven. They didn't have the purposeful rhythm of a search team. I strained to see through the darkness, my heart pounding harder with every passing second. A man appeared at the edge of the creek bed. His face was hard to make out in the dim light, but there was something immediately unsettling about him. He stood there, watching me for what felt like an eternity before he finally spoke. He started talking about the area, his voice low and almost conversational, but the things he said sent a chill down my spine. He mentioned how people often ended up in the creek, how flash floods during hurricane season or storms could sweep them away. His words felt deliberate, like he was trying to unsettle me, or worse, remind me of how vulnerable I was. I tried to move, but the pain in my side flared again, and I stopped. I was trapped, unable to defend myself, completely at this man's mercy. He began looking for a way down into the creek, and panic surged through me. Then I heard it. Brody's distinctive talking, noises cut through the darkness. It was a mix of trills, barks, and the familiar aroo he used when he wanted me to hurry up. Relief flooded through me. Brody was close. The man froze, his head snapping toward the sound. For a moment, he seemed to hesitate. Then, out of the shadows, another figure appeared, a massive German shepherd named Ranger. He was one of our team's dogs, known for his gentle temperament. But in that moment, he was all business. Hackles raised, teeth bared, he growled and barked with a ferocity I'd never seen before. The man backed away, his hands raised slightly as if to placate the dog. Then Brody emerged, his posture mirroring Ranger's, his sharp barks echoing through the trees. It wasn't long before two of my teammates appeared. One was a former Marine officer, and the other had a background in professional MMA fighting. They moved quickly, assessing my condition and stabilizing me while keeping a wary eye on the stranger. The dogs never let up, their growls and barks a constant warning. The man stayed at the edge of the creek, watching silently as my teammates worked. He didn't try to approach again, but he didn't leave either. It wasn't until they secured me onto the backboard and called for the wheeled stretcher that he finally disappeared into the woods. The trek back to camp was excruciating. Every bump and jolt sent pain shooting through my side, but I was too shaken to care. All I could think about was how close I'd come to something far worse than broken ribs and a concussion. Back at camp, the team's medical staff checked me over before sending me to a rural hospital for further evaluation. The doctor confirmed what I already knew: 2 broken ribs and a concussion, but all I could think about was the man in the creek bed. Later, one of the nurses mentioned that the area we'd been training in had a history of assaults, both physical and sexual. The realization made my stomach turn. If Brody and Ranger hadn't shown up when they did, I might have been another statistic. We filed a report with the local authorities, but as far as I know, nothing ever came of it. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what his intentions were. Brody has long since retired, and Ranger is nearing the end of his working years, but I owe them both more than I can put into words. I've had plenty of strange experiences during my time in SAR, but none as disturbing as that night. I still wonder what scent Brody was following that led us so far off course. The training wasn't set up in that direction, and there were no reports of missing persons in the area. Maybe it was nothing, or maybe it was something we were never meant to find. The Tetons have always held a pull for me, a mix of awe, fear, and fascination. Death Canyon Shelf wasn't my first high-altitude trek, but it was the first one that taught me how quickly nature can turn against you, even when you think you're prepared. The name itself felt like a challenge. Death Canyon. I laughed it off when we first planned the trip, thinking the drama of the name was just a ploy to draw hikers seeking thrills. But by the end, I understood it was an exaggeration. We set out late in the season during one of the driest summers in years. The plan was ambitious but manageable. A multi-day trek through the Tetons, high above the treeline, with nights spent camping in exposed terrain that promised breathtaking views. My husband and I had done plenty of backcountry trips before, but nothing quite like this. The first day felt like a dream. The mountains stretched endlessly, their jagged peaks slicing into the blue sky. The air was crisp, the kind that makes you feel alive with every breath. Despite the dry conditions, there was still a wild beauty to the land. Yellowed grasses whispered in the breeze, and patches of stubborn wildflowers clung to life in shady spots. Streams marked boldly on our map turned out to be little more than dusty ribbons of rock, but we weren't too worried. We carried plenty of water, and our packs, though heavy, were manageable. By the second day, the weather began to shift. Clouds piled up on the horizon as we approached a high pass. My husband grew uneasy. He's always been the cautious one, and while I tried to reassure him, I could feel the tension creeping into my own thoughts. Above the treeline, there's no shelter, no safety net. Just you, your gear, and the hope that the weather holds. We pushed hard to clear the pass, my husband driving us forward at a pace that left me winded. His pack was heavier than mine, always is, because he insists on carrying most of the weight, but the heat was punishing. It must have been close to 90 degrees, the sun baking the rocky terrain around us. By the time we reached the top, he was pale and shaky. We kept scanning the map, searching for water, but every blue line we crossed was dry. Each disappointment felt heavier than the last. When he finally admitted he couldn't go any further without water, I knew it was serious. Leaving him there felt wrong, but I didn't see another option. I took the filter and his empty bottles and hurried ahead. The stream wasn't far, just under a mile, but the weight of the situation made it feel endless. When I finally heard the faint gurgle of water, relief washed over me. I crouched by the bank, filtering as quickly as I could. That's when I saw them. First, just ahead, brown, round, and alert. Then another, and another. My stomach dropped. A grizzly and her cubs, not 20 feet away, across the stream. My mind raced. I knew what to do, but knowing and doing are two different things when fear grips you. Slowly, I stood up, arms wide, voice steady but loud. Hey there. Easy. I'm not a threat. The bear's eyes locked onto me, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then she gathered her cubs and moved away, not hurried, not panicked, just purposeful. It was over in seconds, but my hands shook as I finished filtering the water. The hike back to my husband was a blur. Every rustle in the brush set my heart racing, but I forced myself to keep moving. He was sitting right where I'd left him, his face lighting up when he saw the bottles in my hand. I didn't tell him about the bear until much later. There didn't seem to be a point in adding to his worry. That night, we set up camp on the Death Canyon Shelf. The name felt heavier now, less like a joke and more like a warning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the wind picked up, carrying with it a biting chill. Clouds rolled in fast, their edges flickering with lightning. Thunder snow. I'd heard of it, but experiencing it was something else entirely. The storm swept in with a fury, lightning illuminating the tent so brightly it felt like daylight. The air reeked of ozone, sharp and metallic. We crouched in the tent, trying to minimize our contact with the ground, our breaths shallow and quick. Every boom of thunder seemed to shake the earth, and the sound of snow pelting the tent added to the chaos. At some point, I noticed the light outside had changed. For a moment, panic surged. I thought it might be a fire. But when I unzipped the tent, I found a world transformed. For inches of snow had fallen in what felt like no time at all. The landscape was unrecognizable, the sharp edges of the mountains softened by the sudden blanket of white. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving a silence so profound it felt almost oppressive. We stayed awake for hours, too wired to sleep, until exhaustion finally won. The next day, we packed up and started our descent. The snow melted quickly under the morning sun, turning the trails into a slippery mess. My legs ached, my nerves were frayed, but the views were still stunning. We thought the worst was behind us, but the mountains weren't done with us yet. That afternoon, a sudden hailstorm caught us off guard. Marble-sized chunks of ice pelted us as we scrambled for cover, our jackets doing little to stop the sting. By the time it ended, we were soaked and shivering. Hypothermia was a real risk, but we managed to get a fire going once we reached a more sheltered spot. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, I felt like we'd been through a gauntlet. Bears, storms, dehydration, hail. It was like the mountains were testing us, throwing every challenge they could our way. And yet, as we loaded our packs into the car and looked back at the peaks one last time, all I could think about was how beautiful it had been. The fear, the discomfort, the close calls, they were all part of the experience. The Tetons don't coddle you. They demand respect, they push you to your limits, but they also reward you in ways few other places can. It was the best trip of my life. Terrifying, yes, but unforgettable in every way. As we drove away, I found myself already planning our next adventure, because some places just have a way of calling you back. In 2018, I joined a backpacking group for a multi-day trip in North Carolina. The itinerary promised breathtaking views, challenging hikes, and the camaraderie of fellow adventurers. By the third day, I was tired but exhilarated. The kind of tired that makes your legs ache in the best way, knowing you've earned the views and moments shared with strangers who, by now, felt like friends. That morning, we made our way up Pilot Mountain. Not the larger, iconic Pilot Mountain that everyone seems to think of, but the smaller one, less famous, but no less impressive in its rugged beauty. The climb was steep, but the view from the top was worth every ounce of effort. We stopped to take photos, snack on trail mix, and soak in the vast expanse of rolling green hills below. The air was cool, crisp, and just beginning to hint at the colder temperatures that would come as the day waned. Around noon, we began our descent. The trail was rocky and uneven, forcing us to watch every step. I was pacing myself, feeling good despite the weight of my pack pressing into my shoulders. About halfway down, I felt an odd sensation, a brief moment of dizziness, like the world tilted slightly. I stopped to steady myself, assuming it was just fatigue or dehydration. Then, everything hit at once. The dizziness surged into a wave of vertigo, so intense it knocked me off balance. My stomach churned violently, and I barely had time to drop my pack before I collapsed, retching uncontrollably. The world around me spun, trees and rocks blurring into a nauseating whirl. I tried to sit up, but the effort sent another surge of nausea through me, leaving me trembling and disoriented. My group huddled around, their concerned faces blurry as I fought to focus. One of the guides crouched beside me, asking questions I could barely register. How was I feeling? Could I move? Could I eat or drink? The answer to all of them was no. Every attempt to sip water ended with me vomiting again, my body rejecting even the smallest effort to recover. An hour passed this way. The guide kept a close eye on me, while the rest of the group milled around, unsure of what to do. It was clear I couldn't hike out, and with the sun inching lower in the sky, the guide made a decision. He told the others to continue down to camp while he stayed with me, radioing for help. The rescue team would need time to reach us, and there was no guarantee how long it would take. The temperature was dropping. What had been a mild day in the 50s or 60s was now cooling rapidly, and the forecast warned it would plunge into the teens by nightfall. As I lay on the cold ground, shivering uncontrollably, the guide did his best to keep me warm, draping an emergency blanket over me and encouraging me to stay as still as possible. But my body wasn't cooperating. The relentless vomiting left me weak and dehydrated, and without the ability to hold down fluids, my condition was worsening. When the EMT finally arrived, it was a small relief. He assessed my condition quickly, his face grim as he called in for N4. The fluid would rehydrate me, but it also carried a chilling downside. The 4 bag was cold, and with my body already struggling to retain heat, it only made me feel colder. I could feel my limbs growing numb, my breathing shallow as the hours dragged on. Meanwhile, the rescue team was working to cut a trail up to us. The path was too steep and rugged for a stretcher to be carried down safely, so they had to chainsaw through the dense forest to create a workable route. Progress was agonizingly slow. The sound of chainsaws echoed faintly through the trees, each buzz a reminder of how far away help still was. As darkness fell, the guide and EMT debated their next move. My condition wasn't improving, and the dropping temperature posed a real danger. They made the call to request a helicopter. It would take time to get one on standby, but if the rescue team couldn't reach us soon, it might be my only chance. Finally, around 9 p.m., the rescue crew arrived. I remember the relief I felt when I saw the first headlamp bobbing through the darkness. They moved quickly, stabilizing me on a stretcher and wrapping me in additional blankets. Every jolt as they carried me down the newly cut trail sent sharp pain through my body, but I was too exhausted to care. Eventually, we reached a point where they could transfer me to an ATV. The ride was rough, bouncing over rocks and roots, but it was faster than carrying me by hand. By the time we reached the ambulance, I was barely conscious, the combination of cold, dehydration, and exhaustion overwhelming me. The hospital was a blur. They ran tests, CT scans, heart checks, trying to rule out anything life-threatening. When everything came back clear, they discharged me. It was 3 a.m., and I was still too weak to stand or walk. I remember sitting there, stunned, as they explained that I could call a cab, but would need to figure out where to go on my own. That's when a nurse took pity on me. She quietly led me to an empty room, where she brought me water, snacks, and a blanket. She stayed with me until morning, checking in periodically to make sure I was okay. Her kindness was a lifeline in that moment, a reminder that even in the worst situations, there are people who care. The next morning, my backpacking group came back for me. Seeing their faces filled me with a sense of gratitude I can't quite put into words. So many people had worked to save my life that day. The guide who stayed with me, the EMT who kept me stable, the rescue team who braved the dark and cold to reach me, and the nurse who gave me a place to rest when I had nowhere else to go. It's been years since that trip, but I still think about it often. About how quickly things can go wrong, even when you think you're prepared. About how fragile our bodies are, and how much we rely on others in moments of crisis. And most of all, about the strength of the human spirit. The way strangers come together in the face of adversity, each doing their part to ensure someone else makes it through. I haven't been back to Pilot Mountain since, but one day I'd like to. Not to relive the fear or the pain, but to stand at the top again and remind myself how far I've come. In my years working as a consultant to the Provincial Forestry Service, I'd been in plenty of dangerous situations, but none of them prepared me for that day. My role was to map fire line fuel loads in ash pits, using an infrared and LiDAR-equipped drone to provide critical data on fire activity. It was a job that demanded precision, focus, and a high tolerance for risk, especially when operating near active fires. But no amount of experience could make you completely immune to the fear that came with it. The plan that morning was straightforward enough. I'd be airlifted to a point above the active fire, deploy my equipment, map the fire, and then signal the helicopter to pick me up. This had become a routine over the last few days, and while routine might sound like a stretch when describing jumping out of a helicopter onto precarious ridges, it had started to feel manageable. The helicopter would perform a toe-in landing, hovering with just the tip of one skid on the edge of a rocky outcrop. I'd jump out quickly, try to avoid breaking a leg, and then catch my 70-pound equipment case before it rolled off the ledge. Not exactly comfortable, but it worked. That morning, though, I had a bad feeling. The kind of unease you can't explain, but also can't ignore. Maybe it was the way the fire had behaved overnight, aggressive, consuming everything in its path, leaving the air thick with smoke and ash. Maybe it was the way the winds had picked up, erratic and unpredictable, carrying embers high into the sky and dropping them miles away. Or maybe it was just the fact that I was a 60-year-old cancer survivor and partial amputee, trying to keep pace with a job that felt increasingly unforgiving. The helicopter dropped me off on what I can only describe as a knife's edge, a 2-foot-wide ridgeline with sheer drops on either side. Below me, the entire face of the mountain was ablaze, flames roaring like an ocean in a storm. The heat was intense, even from that height, and the smoke stung my eyes and throat. I set up my drone and began flying the mapping route, trying to ignore the rising sense of dread in my chest. Every movement felt precarious, like one wrong step could send me tumbling down the mountain. Once the mapping was complete, I packed up the equipment and radioed the helicopter for pickup. I could hear it approaching, the sound of the rotors cutting through the thick smoke, but I couldn't see it. Minutes passed as the helicopter circled, trying to find me through the haze. Then the radio crackled. The pilot couldn't see either the original drop point or the alternate landing zone. The smoke was too thick, visibility too poor. They told me I'd have to hike down to the northeast, where the fire wasn't as bad. As bad turned out to be a relative term. I looked down the slope in the direction they'd indicated. The fire had consumed much of the vegetation, leaving charred stumps and smoldering debris in its wake. Flames still licked at the trees further down, and the ground was littered with ash pits, hidden pockets of intense heat that could burn straight through boots if you weren't careful. And then there was the matter of the 70 pounds of equipment I had to carry with me. At that moment, a single thought crossed my mind. I am too old for this shit. But there was no choice. The helicopter couldn't get to me, and staying put wasn't an option. The fire was advancing, and the ridge offered no protection. So I slung the heavy case over my shoulder and began the descent. Every step was a battle. The slope was steep and treacherous, the ground shifting under my boots as I navigated through loose rocks and charred debris. The heat was unbearable, and the smoke made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I stumbled often, my balance thrown off by the weight of the equipment. More than once, I felt the searing pain of burning embers landing on my arms or back, forcing me to drop to the ground and roll in the dirt to put out the flames. The sound of the fire was constant, an ominous roar punctuated by the sharp crack of falling trees. I was hyper-aware of my surroundings, scanning for anything that might signal danger. A tree about to topple, a patch of ground that looked too unstable, a sudden shift in the wind that could send flames racing in my direction. Despite my efforts, there were close calls. A tree fell mere feet away from me at one point, the impact sending a shockwave through the ground and scattering burning branches in every direction. I barely managed to dodge the debris, my heart pounding as I pressed on. Hours passed this way. My clothes were soaked with sweat, and every breath felt like inhaling sandpaper. My legs ached from the constant strain, and the weight of the equipment seemed to double with every step. I lost track of how many times I had to stop and drop to the ground, extinguishing small fires on my sleeves or pant legs. At one point, I stumbled into an ash pit, the heat burning through the soles of my boots before I managed to scramble free. I began to wonder if I'd make it out at all. The fire was unpredictable, and I had no way of knowing if the path ahead would lead to safety or trap me in an inferno. But giving up wasn't an option. So I kept moving, one agonizing step at a time. Eventually, I heard voices, faint at first, then growing louder. A team of firefighters emerged from the smoke, their faces smudged with soot and their gear battered from the battle against the flames. Relief washed over me as they approached, taking the equipment from my hands and guiding me down the remaining stretch of the mountain. We reached a safe landing zone where the helicopter was waiting. I don't think I've ever been so grateful to see those spinning rotors. The firefighters helped me into the chopper, and as we lifted off, I looked down at the burning landscape below. The scale of the destruction was staggering, but all I could think about was how close I'd come to being part of it. I spent the next 2 days in the hospital, treated for smoke inhalation and dozens of burns. The doctors were amazed I'd managed to make it out at all, given the conditions. As I lay in that hospital bed, replaying the events in my mind, I made a decision. I was done. I wouldn't map another forest fire. I'd had my fill of near-death experiences, and it was time to step away. I walked away from that job with a newfound respect for the men and women who fight wildfires. They face those conditions every day, risking their lives to protect others. They are some of the bravest, most selfless people I've ever met. As for me, I'll always carry the scars, both physical and emotional, from that day. But I also carry the knowledge that, even in the most desperate moments, the human spirit is capable of incredible resilience. The forest had always been a sanctuary for me, a place to escape the noise of the world and find a kind of peace that only comes with being surrounded by untamed wilderness. I'd camped in all kinds of conditions: torrential rain, biting cold, suffocating heat. I'd dealt with plenty of challenges out there, from hypothermia to stubborn bears rummaging around my campsite. But nothing could have prepared me for the night of the derecho in West Virginia. For those unfamiliar, a derecho is a freak of nature, an immense wall of wind that moves faster than you'd think possible, uprooting trees, flipping cars, and occasionally flattening small buildings. When you're out in the woods surrounded by towering trees, it's more than unnerving, it's downright terrifying. That night, though, the windstorm wasn't the only thing that made my heart pound. I had set up camp earlier that day in what I thought was a relatively secure spot. It wasn't exactly traditional camping. My tent was inside a single-walled pavilion, the kind of thing you might find at a state park picnic area, with a cement floor and a roof overhead. Not exactly cozy, but it was protection against the rain and gave me a false sense of security. I remember thinking, at least I won't have to worry about trees falling directly on me. The forest was thick here, dense enough that the idea of trees coming down was a constant background concern. The day had been humid, the air heavy with the kind of oppressive heat that makes every movement feel like a chore. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened ominously, a clear warning of the storm to come. I'd heard about the derecho in weather reports before heading out, but I underestimated just how violent it could be. As night fell, the wind started picking up, pushing through the trees in bursts that sounded like far-off trains. By the time the derecho hit, it was chaos. The wind screamed through the forest, shaking the pavilion and making me question whether the roof above me would hold. Branches snapped like gunshots, and the sound of falling trees echoed in every direction. The rain came down in sheets, so heavy that it felt like being caught in a waterfall. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could feel the cold seeping through my clothes despite the effort I'd made to layer up. I sat huddled in my tent, trying to ignore the groans of the pavilion's wooden supports when I first heard it. A low huffing sound, unmistakable in the silence that followed a particularly strong gust of wind. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on my ears. But then came the sound of claws, clack, 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 against the cement floor. My stomach dropped as the realization hit me. I wasn't alone under the pavilion. The black bear had found its way into the structure, seeking the same shelter I had. It must have been panicked by the storm, confused and angry, and now it was pacing. I could hear it circling my tent, its claws tapping rhythmically on the concrete. The sound was almost hypnotic. Tap, tap, tap. It was accompanied by its heavy breathing, a series of loud huffs and grunts that made my blood run cold. I'd encountered black bears before. Usually, they were more scared of me than I was of them. A few loud shouts, maybe some banging on a pot or a stick, and they'd take off running. This bear, though, was different. It wasn't acting out of curiosity or hunger. It was agitated, frantic, and seemed just as trapped as I was. I shouted, trying to scare it off. My voice sounded small and weak against the roar of the wind. The bear didn't retreat. If anything, my yelling seemed to irritate it more. It began moving faster, circling closer to the tent. Every now and then it would stop, sniff the air, and then resume its frantic pacing. The storm outside only added to the terror. Gale-force winds ripped through the trees, the sound of snapping branches and crashing trunks constant now. Rain pelted the pavilion roof, so loud it felt like the storm was right on top of me. And through it all, the bear kept pacing, its claws clacking against the cement, its huffs and grunts growing louder. I knew I couldn't stay in the tent indefinitely. If the bear decided to investigate further or charge, I'd have no time to react. I grabbed my hunting knife from my pack, my hands trembling as I duct-taped the handle to my palm. The thought of having to defend myself against the bear was horrifying, but I wanted to be ready for the worst. Minutes turned into hours as I sat there, my heart pounding with every sound. The bear would leave the pavilion for a few moments, only to return just as suddenly. Each time it came back, it seemed more agitated, its pacing more frantic. I could picture it out there, its dark shape moving in the storm, its eyes reflecting the dim light from my headlamp. At one point, I heard a massive crash outside, another tree falling, somewhere nearby. The bear let out a startled roar, its frustration evident. For a moment, I thought it might leave for good. But no, the sound of its claws returned, tapping out an uneven rhythm as it circled again. By now, my nerves were shot. The storm, the bear, the cold, it was all too much. I felt trapped, completely powerless against the forces of nature and the unpredictable behavior of the animal just a few feet away. Finally, as the winds began to die down in the early hours of the morning, the bear seemed to lose interest. It stopped pacing, huffed one last time, and lumbered out of the pavilion. I listened intently, holding my breath, as its footsteps faded into the distance. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. The storm was still raging, though less violently, and I was too shaken to do anything but sit there, clutching the knife taped to my hand. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep, my body curled into a tight ball inside the tent. When I woke, the storm had passed. The forest was eerily quiet, the aftermath of the derecho evident in the destruction around me. Trees were down everywhere, their roots torn from the ground. Branches littered the area, and the pavilion itself had sustained some damage, though it had held up better than I expected. There was no sign of the bear. I packed up my gear quickly, my hands still shaking as I worked. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the trail, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the pavilion. The walkout was sobering, a reminder of just how small and vulnerable we are in the face of nature's power. That night taught me a lot about fear, about patience, and about the importance of respecting the wild. It's an experience I'll never forget, and one that made me deeply appreciate the fragility of the barrier between us and the natural world. The Grand Canyon is a breathtaking place, a marvel of nature, a wonder that humbles you the moment you set foot near its edges. The colors, the vastness, the sheer depth of it all. It's the kind of place where you feel both awe and insignificance at the same time. We'd been planning the trip for months, hoping to instill a love of nature in our little girl, who at 3 years old was just starting to grasp the world around her. It was supposed to be an adventure, a fun bonding experience. Instead, it turned into the most terrifying day of my life. The day started off beautifully, the kind of clear, sunny morning you expect in the Arizona desert. Temperatures were already climbing, but we were prepared. We had plenty of water, sun hats, sunscreen, the works. Our campsite wasn't too far from the main area, but far enough that we felt surrounded by the quiet solitude of nature. The Grand Canyon loomed in the distance, its massive walls glowing in the morning sun. Our daughter was in a great mood, full of energy as usual. She had a mischievous streak, always loved playing little games, especially hide and seek. It was something I'd introduced to her months before, thinking it was a harmless way to keep her entertained. She loved the thrill of hiding, waiting for us to find her, giggling the whole time. At the time, I had no idea how that innocent game would haunt me. We'd spent the morning exploring a nearby trail, keeping things light since it was so hot. By noon, the sun was brutal, and we decided to head back to camp to rest. Our daughter had been walking with us, holding my hand, her little face red from exertion but smiling. She was babbling about the rocks and the birds, her tiny voice almost drowned out by the cicadas buzzing in the heat. When we got back to camp, I sat her down with a juice box and some snacks while my husband started organizing our gear. It was one of those moments where everything felt normal, almost mundane. I don't remember the exact second she vanished. It was that fast. One moment, she was there, sitting on the camp chair, sipping her juice. The next, the chair was empty, and my heart stopped. "Where is she?" I asked, my voice already rising. My husband looked up from what he was doing, confused. "She was just here," he said. We started calling her name. First calmly, then louder, more urgently. Maybe she wandered off to look at something, I thought, trying to tamp down the rising panic. But the longer it took, the more frantic we became. The campsite wasn't huge, and we combed it in minutes. No sign of her. I checked the van, my hands shaking as I opened the sliding door. "She's not here," I yelled, slamming the door shut and running to the next site. My husband was doing the same, calling her name, his voice echoing in the oppressive heat. The fear was like a living thing, growing with every second. My mind went to dark places. The Grand Canyon is vast, full of cliffs and drop-offs. What if she'd wandered too close to the edge? What if she'd fallen? Or what if someone had taken her? The possibilities were endless, each one more horrifying than the last. I could barely breathe as I ran from site to site, yelling her name, my voice cracking. Other campers joined in, their concerned faces blurring together as I tried to hold it together. My vision tunneled, and the world seemed to close in around me. The heat was oppressive, suffocating, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. My husband was the one who found her. I heard him shout, and for a moment, I didn't register what he was saying. Then it hit me, he'd found her. She was in the van I'd already checked. I ran back to him, my legs feeling like they were moving through molasses. There she was, our little girl, climbing out from under a pile of clothes in the back of the van. She looked up at us with wide, innocent eyes, completely unaware of the chaos she'd caused. It all came rushing at once. The relief, the guilt, the overwhelming flood of emotions that left me shaking and gasping for air. She'd been hiding, playing hide and seek, just like I'd taught her. She thought it was a game, but it wasn't a game. The van had been sitting in the sun all day. The temperature outside was over 100 degrees, and inside the van, it was even hotter. She could have died. I had closed the door, trapping her in that oven without even realizing it. The thought made me physically ill. We canceled the rest of the camping trip that day. There was no way we could stay after that. We packed up our things in silence, the weight of what had almost happened hanging heavy between us. My husband booked a cabin nearby, a place with air conditioning and solid walls, where we could regroup and try to process what had happened. That night, as I lay in bed watching my daughter sleep, I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. The empty camp chair, the frantic search, the moment we found her, and the sickening realization of how close we'd come to losing her. In another universe, my husband didn't find her in time. I didn't check the van again. She stayed hidden under the clothes, and the heat did what it does. That thought will haunt me for the rest of my life. She's alive. She's okay. But that day changed me. I've never felt fear like that, the kind that grips your soul and refuses to let go. I learned how quickly things can go wrong, how a moment's distraction can turn into a nightmare. To this day, I can't look at that van without feeling a knot in my stomach. I've double-checked every door and every corner 100 times since then. I don't think I'll ever stop. I was 8 years younger, full of wanderlust and the thrill of discovery, when I set out on a road trip that would take me from southern Ontario down the eastern seaboard, through the southern U.S., and all the way to California. My car was packed with camping gear, a small cooler, a few maps, and the kind of confidence that only comes from experience in the woods. I'd spent years hiking and camping in Canada's mixed and boreal forests, where I knew the land like the back of my hand. I didn't think twice about stepping into unknown territory. I figured nature was nature. It's all the same once you're in it. That mindset, I now realize, was my first mistake. By the time I reached Utah, I'd already covered thousands of miles, and Bryce Canyon caught my attention. Pictures didn't do it justice. The red and orange hoodoos rose like ancient sentinels, their surreal shapes carved by time and weather. I was mesmerized and decided to camp there for a couple of nights to soak it all in. The desert environment was new to me, but I wasn't worried. I thought my experience would translate seamlessly. I arrived at the park mid-morning and secured a backcountry camping permit. The ranger on duty explained the rules and highlighted a few trails on the map. I nodded along, only half listening, eager to get out and explore. When he briefly mentioned flash floods as a risk, I didn't think much of it. Sure, I'd heard about them, but they felt like one of those rare, unlucky events that happen to other people. I was more focused on choosing a route that would give me good photo opportunities and solitude. I picked a trail that wound down into the canyon. The descent was breathtaking. The hoodoos towered around me, their deep red hues glowing in the sunlight. The air was dry, the kind of dryness that makes your throat scratchy if you don't sip water constantly. I hiked for hours, stopping often to take photos and just stand in awe of the landscape. It felt like walking on another planet, one stripped of its greenery and laid bare to reveal the raw beauty of the Earth's bones. I found a spot near the canyon floor to set up camp, a flat area sheltered by a few large rocks. It wasn't official, but I figured it was remote enough to avoid any issues. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows that made the hoodoos look even more otherworldly. I cooked a quick meal on my portable stove, laid out my sleeping bag, and settled in for the night. The silence was deafening. Back home, the woods were alive at night, owls hooting, crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Here, there was nothing but an eerie stillness. It took me a while to fall asleep, my body unused to the quiet. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to explore more of the canyon. The day was overcast, but it didn't bother me. In the forests I was used to, overcast skies were just a sign of cooler weather, maybe light rain. I didn't think to check the forecast or question what rain might mean in this environment. I hiked deeper into the canyon, following a narrow trail that snaked along the floor. The rocks around me rose higher and higher, and I felt small, insignificant in the best way. I didn't notice the first drops of rain at first. They were so light, so sparse, that I thought it might have been my imagination. But then they came faster, heavier, soaking into my shirt and dripping off my hat. I cursed under my breath, annoyed that I hadn't brought my rain gear, but I wasn't too worried. Rain wasn't a big deal. Or so I thought. That's when I noticed the small trickle of water running across the trail in front of me. It hadn't been there before. At first, I thought it was interesting, a small, harmless stream forming right before my eyes. I kept walking, but the trickle quickly grew into a stream. Within minutes, it was a small river, flowing faster and faster. That's when it clicked. The ranger's words about flash floods came rushing back to me, and a cold pit formed in my stomach. The realization hit me hard. I wasn't in a forest with spongy soil and dense vegetation to slow the water down. I was in a canyon, surrounded by bare rock that funneled every drop of rain into one concentrated flow. The walls of the canyon were my prison, and I was standing at the bottom of what was quickly becoming a river. I didn't have time to panic. My instincts kicked in, and I turned around, heading back the way I'd come. The rain was coming down harder now, and the water was rising alarmingly fast. The once dry trail was now a slick, muddy mess, and every step felt precarious. My boots slid on the wet rock, and I had to use my hands to steady myself as I climbed. The water was up to my ankles, then my calves. It was moving so fast that I could feel it trying to pull me off balance. I kept climbing, my heart pounding in my chest. The slope was steep, and I had to scramble on all fours at some points, the mud caking my hands and knees. I could hear the water roaring behind me, getting louder and louder. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I hesitated, if I slipped, I might not get back up. Finally, I reached a ledge that was higher and wider. I collapsed onto it, gasping for air, my legs trembling from the effort. I looked back at the trail I just climbed, and my stomach dropped. The area where I'd been standing minutes ago was completely underwater. A raging torrent of muddy water filled the canyon floor, carrying rocks, debris, and anything else in its path. If I'd waited even a minute longer, I wouldn't have made it out. I sat there for a long time, watching the water rush by, too stunned to move. My mind was racing, replaying the events over and over. How close I'd come to being swept away. How my overconfidence had nearly cost me my life. The rain eventually stopped, and the floodwaters began to recede, but I stayed on that ledge until I was certain it was safe to move. When I finally made it back to my car, I was soaked, muddy, and shaken to my core. I didn't even bother changing out of my wet clothes. I just sat there for a while, staring at the canyon, trying to process what had just happened. It was a humbling experience, a stark reminder that nature doesn't care how experienced you think you are. It doesn't care about your plans or your confidence. It just is, and it's up to you to respect it. A few months later, I had another close call while hiking in Ontario's Algonquin Park. I was on a trail late in the season when two black bear cubs crossed in front of me, no more than 10 feet away. They didn't seem to notice me, but I knew better than to stick around. Where there are cubs, there's a mother, and surprising a bear with her cubs is one of the fastest ways to end up in serious trouble. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, and left the area as quickly and quietly as I could. These experiences changed the way I approach the outdoors. They taught me that no matter how prepared you think you are, there's always something you can't control. They taught me humility and respect for the natural world. And most of all, they taught me that survival isn't about strength or skill. It's about adaptability and the will to keep moving forward, even when the odds are against you. Camping alone in the wilderness had always been my way of escaping the chaos of life. There was something about being surrounded by nature, disconnected from the constant buzz of technology and people, that brought me peace. I had been to the Adirondacks several times before, but this trip was different. I wanted complete isolation, and I knew just the spot, a remote area deep in the forest, miles from any trailhead. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first day went smoothly. The drive to the trailhead was long but scenic, winding through dense woods and small mountain towns. Once I parked and loaded up my gear, it was a 2-hour hike to the campsite I had in mind. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy smell of fallen leaves and pine. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I pitched my tent near a small creek, the gentle sound of water flowing over rocks adding to the serenity. I gathered some dry wood and started a fire, the flickering flames casting warm light against the encroaching darkness. Dinner was simple, a packet of freeze-dried pasta and a cup of hot tea. As I sat by the fire, watching the stars emerge in the clear night sky, I felt a sense of contentment. This was exactly what I had been looking for. The first night passed without incident. I slept soundly, lulled by the sounds of the creek and the occasional hoot of an owl. Morning came with a soft golden light filtering through the trees. After a quick breakfast, I spent the day exploring the area, snapping photos of the scenery and jotting down notes in my journal. I even found a small clearing with an incredible view of the mountains in the distance. As the second night approached, I felt a little more on edge. Maybe it was the increasing stillness of the woods or the way the shadows seemed darker and more oppressive, but I brushed it off as my imagination. I told myself I'd been watching too many documentaries about wilderness survival and predators. After dinner, I sat by the fire again, enjoying the crackling flames and the sharp chill in the air. That's when I felt it, the distinct, unnerving sensation of being watched. It wasn't a sound or a shadow, just a deep, primal feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced around the campsite, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing. Just trees and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Still, the feeling lingered. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was paranoia. After all, I was miles from the nearest trailhead, deep in a part of the forest that few people visited. The chances of someone else being out here were slim to none, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I eventually decided to call it a night. I doused the fire, making sure the embers were completely out, and climbed into my tent. I zipped it up tightly and settled into my sleeping bag, clutching my flashlight and a small hatchet I always carried when camping alone. Despite my unease, exhaustion eventually pulled me into a restless sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. The fire was long dead, but the faint glow of the moon filtered through the thin fabric of the tent. The woods were eerily silent, the usual chorus of crickets and nocturnal creatures replaced by an oppressive stillness. Then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps. They were faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking just outside my tent. My heart began to pound, the sound roaring in my ears. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then resumed, slow and measured, as if whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. I gripped the hatchet tightly, my palms slick with sweat. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The footsteps circled the tent, pausing every so often, as if the intruder was studying it, or me. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in terror. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to stretch and blur. At one point, the footsteps stopped completely, and I thought maybe whoever it was had left. But then, from the direction of the creek, I heard the faint crunch of leaves. They were still there. I debated what to do. Should I shout? Try to scare them off? What if it wasn't a person but an animal, like a bear or a mountain lion? What if shouting only provoked it? The thought paralyzed me further. The footsteps faded into the woods after a while, but I didn't dare move. I stayed in that same position, clutching the hatchet, until the first light of dawn seeped through the trees. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and step outside, my legs were stiff and shaky. The campsite looked undisturbed at first glance, but then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, circling my tent. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. I quickly packed up my gear, my eyes darting around the forest, half expecting to see someone watching me from the shadows. I didn't stop to eat or rest, just threw everything into my pack and started hiking back to the trailhead. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing, but I didn't encounter anyone or anything on the way out. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool morning air. I tossed my pack into the back seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. To this day, I have no idea who or what was out there with me that night. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was another camper who stumbled across my sight by accident, or a hunter passing through. But the deliberate, almost methodical way those footsteps circled my tent doesn't fit with either explanation. I haven't been back to that part of the Adirondacks since. Camping still brings me peace, but I stick to more populated areas now, places where I'm not completely alone. That feeling of being watched, of knowing someone was out there in the dark, still haunts me. It's a reminder that no matter how experienced you are, the wilderness holds dangers you can't always prepare for. Bryce Canyon had always been on my list of must-see places. The photos of its surreal, rocky spires, called hoodoos, were mesmerizing. I was used to camping and hiking in dense forests, but I wanted to try something new. Bryce Canyon, with its open desert-like terrain, seemed like the perfect challenge. So I packed my gear, jumped in my car, and headed for the famous canyon. I arrived on a sunny morning, the kind that fills you with confidence and energy. The air was dry, and the sky stretched endlessly overhead, a brilliant blue that made everything feel alive. After stopping at the visitor center for a map and some tips, I picked a trail that descended into the canyon and planned to camp near the bottom. It wasn't crowded, and the solitude felt refreshing. The descent was stunning. The hoodoos rose like jagged towers, their red and orange hues glowing in the sunlight. The trail twisted and turned, offering incredible views at every step. I felt like I was walking through another planet. By the time I reached the canyon floor, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the landscape. I found a flat area to set up camp near a dry riverbed and pitched my tent. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple meal, wrote some notes in my journal, and enjoyed the peace of being so far from civilization. The stars overhead were brighter than I had ever seen, blanketing the sky like a sparkling ocean. The silence of the canyon was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse bushes. The next morning, I woke up early, eager to explore. The weather had changed slightly overnight. Clouds were rolling in, and the air felt heavier. I wasn't too concerned. Back in the forests I was used to, clouds often meant a light drizzle at worst, and I figured the dry conditions in the canyon would soak up any rain quickly. I spent the day hiking around, marveling at the strange beauty of the rocks and the unique shapes carved by centuries of erosion. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed the clouds thickening, and a faint rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. I decided it was time to head back to camp. By the time I reached the canyon floor, the rain had started. At first, it was just a light drizzle, barely enough to dampen the ground. But within minutes, it turned into a steady downpour. I began to notice the dry riverbed near my camp filling with tiny streams of water, trickling down from the higher ground. That's when it hit me. I realized I was in a flash flood zone. The barren, rocky terrain of Bryce Canyon doesn't absorb water like the forests I was used to. Instead, rainwater flows rapidly downhill, collecting in the lowest parts of the canyon, the exact spot where I had set up camp. What had been a trickle at my feet quickly grew into a shallow stream. Panic set in. I knew I needed to get to higher ground immediately. Leaving my tent behind, I grabbed my backpack, which thankfully held my essentials: water, snacks, a flashlight, and a first aid kit, and started climbing the nearest slope. The rain was relentless, and the stream was now a rushing river, growing faster and deeper with each passing minute. The dry canyon floor I had admired earlier was disappearing beneath the water. As I climbed, the ground became slippery and unstable, the red clay turning to slick mud under my boots. Every step was a struggle. My heart was racing, and my breath came in short gasps. I could hear the roar of the water behind me, growing louder as the river swelled. Looking back, I saw my tent being swallowed by the rising flood. The sheer power of the water was terrifying, carrying debris, branches, rocks, and mud along with it. I focused on moving upward, clinging to roots and rocks to steady myself. But the slope was steep, and the rain made it nearly impossible to find solid footing. My hands were scraped and muddy, my legs trembling with the effort. At one point, I slipped and fell, sliding several feet before catching hold of a jagged rock. My palms stung, and I could feel blood mixing with the rainwater, but I didn't stop. I knew I had to keep climbing. The higher I went, the more treacherous the terrain became. The once dry canyon walls were now slick waterfalls, water pouring down in streams that made every step a gamble. I had to pause frequently, leaning against the rock to catch my breath and steady my nerves. Each time I stopped, I looked back at the river below, which had transformed into a raging torrent. Minutes felt like hours, and every muscle in my body burned with exhaustion. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and the temperature had dropped, adding to my misery. I was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I reached a small ledge that offered some stability. It wasn't exactly high ground, but it was far enough above the floodwaters to feel relatively safe. I collapsed onto the rocky surface, gasping for air and trying to process what had just happened. I stayed on that ledge for hours, watching as the flood raged below. The rain continued, but the water level eventually stopped rising. My tent and everything in it were gone, carried away by the river. I felt a pang of loss, but I was too grateful to be alive to dwell on it. As night fell, the rain finally began to ease. The floodwaters receded slowly, leaving behind a muddy, debris-strewn landscape. I knew I couldn't risk descending in the dark, so I huddled on the ledge, wrapping myself in the emergency blanket from my backpack. It wasn't much, but it kept me from freezing completely. When morning came, the canyon was unrecognizable. What had been a serene, dry landscape was now a chaotic mess of mud, rocks, and broken trees. The riverbed was still flowing, though much calmer than the night before. Carefully, I made my way down the slope, slipping and sliding on the muddy ground. I didn't bother looking for my tent or gear. The flood had swept everything away, and I knew it wasn't worth risking my life to search for it. My focus was on getting back to the trailhead and to safety. The hike out was grueling. Every step was a reminder of the previous night's ordeal, my muscles aching and my hands stinging from the cuts and scrapes. But as I climbed out of the canyon and onto the main trail, I felt a profound sense of relief. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, my body and mind utterly drained. I sat there for a long time, staring at the canyon in the distance. It was still beautiful, but now it held a different kind of power, a reminder of how quickly nature can turn against you, how fragile our place in the world really is. I never went back to Bryce Canyon after that trip. The memory of that night still lingers, a vivid reminder of my vulnerability and the raw, unpredictable force of nature. It taught me to respect the wilderness in a way I never had before, to never underestimate its ability to change in an instant. It wasn't just the flood that scared me. It was how close I had come to not making it out. That day, I truly understood what it meant to survive. It was late fall, and the air was crisp as I set out for a 3-day hike through Ontario's Algonquin Park. The trees were just past their peak colors, and the forest was quiet, with most of the summer crowds gone. This was the kind of solitude I craved, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of daily life and reconnect with nature. I had been hiking and camping for years, mostly in this part of the world. The dense boreal forests and countless lakes made it a perfect place for solitude. The trails were familiar to me, and I felt comfortable navigating the wild, even late in the season when the days were shorter and the nights colder. The first day was uneventful. I hiked along a well-marked trail, enjoying the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I set up camp near a lake, where the reflection of the setting sun painted the water in shades of orange and pink. The night was chilly but peaceful, the kind of calm that made you forget about the dangers of the wilderness. On the second day, I planned to cover more ground, following a loop that would eventually bring me back to the trailhead. The forest felt different that morning, quieter than usual. The only sounds were my boots on the trail and the occasional call of a distant bird. As the day wore on, the stillness began to feel almost oppressive. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just the solitude playing tricks on my mind. By late afternoon, I was deep in the forest, far from any road or other campers. The trail narrowed, winding through a dense section of pine trees. The air was colder here, and the shadows stretched long across the path. I was about 2 hours from my next planned campsite when I saw them. 2 black bear cubs. They were tiny, probably no more than a few months old, their glossy black fur standing out against the brown and yellow forest floor. They walked right across the trail in front of me, maybe 5 or 10 feet away. My first reaction was awe. They were adorable, clumsy little creatures, completely unaware of my presence. But awe quickly turned to dread. Where there are bear cubs, there is a mother bear. And a mother bear is not something you want to encounter in the wild, especially when her cubs are involved. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced through everything I knew about black bears. Unlike grizzlies, black bears were generally more skittish around humans, more likely to run away than attack. But a mother protecting her cubs was a completely different story. If she felt I was a threat, she wouldn't hesitate to charge. The cubs continued to toddle across the trail, disappearing into the bushes on the other side. I stood there, not daring to move, straining my ears for any sign of the mother bear. The forest was eerily silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. And then I heard it, a low, guttural huff, followed by the unmistakable sound of branches snapping. She was close. Panic surged through me. I looked around, trying to assess my options. Running was out of the question. Bears are fast, much faster than any human. Climbing a tree wasn't a good idea either. Black bears are excellent climbers. The best thing I could do was stay calm, make myself look as big as possible, and slowly back away. I took a deep breath, raised my arms above my head, and started speaking in a steady, firm voice. Easy now. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just passing through. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the bushes where I had heard the sound. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to move deliberately, step by step. Every muscle in my body screamed to turn and run, but I knew that would be a death sentence. The huffing grew louder, closer. Through the dense underbrush, I caught a glimpse of her, a massive black bear, her dark eyes locked on me. She stepped onto the trail, her head low, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't charging, not yet, but her posture was clear. She saw me as a threat. I kept backing away, my voice steady, but my hands trembling. It's okay. I'm leaving. You can have the trail. She followed me, keeping a distance of about 20 feet, her eyes never leaving mine. Every step I took felt like a gamble. Would she decide I was too close? Would she charge? The tension was unbearable, a constant, gnawing fear that any second could be my last. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a bend in the trail. I moved around it, breaking her line of sight, and immediately picked up my pace. I didn't run, but I walked as fast as I could without making noise, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit. I didn't hear her following me, but I didn't stop. I kept moving until I was sure I had put enough distance between us. Only then did I allow myself to breathe, leaning against a tree as my legs threatened to give out. The sun was setting, and I knew I needed to find a safe place to camp, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there watching. Every shadow in the forest seemed to move, every rustle of leaves made my heart skip a beat. I finally found a small clearing and set up camp, my hands still shaking as I pitched the tent. I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to attract any more attention. Instead, I ate a cold meal and climbed into my sleeping bag, clutching my bear spray like a lifeline. That night was the longest of my life. Every sound outside the tent, every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, felt like a threat. I barely slept, my mind replaying the encounter over and over, imagining all the ways it could have gone wrong. By morning, the forest felt different again. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the chirping of birds and the rustling of small animals. It was as if the danger had passed, as if the forest itself had decided to let me go. I packed up quickly, eager to put more distance between myself and the bear. The rest of the hike was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the lingering unease. Even when I reached the trailhead and saw my car waiting for me, I didn't feel completely safe until I was miles away from the park. That encounter changed the way I think about the wilderness. I had always respected nature, but this was different. It was a reminder of how small and vulnerable we are out there, how little control we really have. I still hike and camp, but I'm more cautious now. I carry bear spray on every trip, even in areas where bears are rare. And I never forget that feeling, the weight of her gaze, the sound of her huffing, the raw power of something that could end me in an instant. That day in Algonquin Park was a close call, one I'll never forget. It was a humbling experience, a reminder that the wilderness is not just a place of beauty and solitude, but also a place where survival is never guaranteed.